Okay, so as we said with the timed essay, the elements that we want to focus on here are breath pauses, enjambment, caesuras or caesuras, and line breaks. All right, so if you look in your textbook defines enjambment as a line that runs over, and it provides an example for you. But you can just see, enjambment. Here we go. It's on Roman numeral XLIII in the middle of the book. Your book says, just as with meter, you should be especially interested in rhyme irregularities. In Dickinson's poem, for example, the rhyme suggests we ought to pause after away in the 6th line, but the grammar of the sentence compels us to hurry on to line 7. Poets often do this, using our natural sense of syntax to work against the rhythm of the rhyme. When one line seems to launch you without pause into the next, we call it enjambment. Now, if you go back and look at what your book is telling you about rhymes and stanzas early on, you've got Emily Dickinson. Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves and immortality. We slowly drove, he knew no haste, and I had put away my labor and my leisure too for his civility. So what do we mean by breath pauses and enjambment? All right, if you look at that page, XLII, Rhyme and Stanzas, you can see that Emily Dickinson is actually quite famous for her dashes. People have written entire doctoral dissertations on Emily Dickinson's dashes. It is a subject much studied. But it is the way in which she tells us to stop. And punctuation, when you are reading a piece of prose, punctuation does that. You notice that you read, for example, rhyme and stanzas, right? Listen. Rhyme is the repetition of sound in different words, period. We pause when we hit a period. Usually, tiny little pause because it's a comma. Usually the repeated sound is in the end of the word, period. So in prose, the breath pauses are actually supposed to be controlled by the punctuation. When you hit a period, you're supposed to stop and inhale for a moment. Yes? Okay. Similarly, if you look at poetry, and I know sometimes it's hard to do this because the thing that stands out to you in poetry is the line length, but the punctuation itself provides a breath pause. And Emily Dickinson's double dashes or long dashes, they make you stop for a second and then rush. Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves and immortality. Those long dashes make a very, very sharp place where you stop and then carry forward. So that first stanza is kind of breathless, even though it's got these breath pauses, because you're rushing headlong and then stopping, and rushing headlong and then stopping. And then you look at that second stanza, and there's only 2 long dashes, and they're not where you expect them to be. We slowly drove. He knew no haste, and I had to put away my labor and my leisure too for his civility. You see, the punctuation and the line lengths work together. So what do we mean by enjambment? Okay, if you look again at that Emily Dickinson stanza, the first stanza has regular stops at the end of each line. You stop at death, you stop at me, you stop at ourselves, and you stop at immortality as well because there's a period there. But if you look at that bottom stanza, you rush through. He knew no haste, and I had to put away my labor and my leisure too. That's enjambment, when the line runs over, when there isn't some kind of a stop at the end of the line, and you keep on going. Okay, so what is the difference between an enjambment and a caesura or a caesura? Well, as it happens, and your book doesn't really talk about it, but think of it this way. The word caesura is related to the word scissors. It is, in fact, the Latin word for cutting. So let's look at that second stanza again on page XLII. We slowly drove. He knew no haste. That line is cut in half. A caesura or caesura is a cutting of the line in the middle. A piece of punctuation normally, a piece of punctuation that makes you stop in your tracks in the middle of the line. Okay, so that's a caesura. And as you can tell, I mean, just to sort of refresh, if you go back to the whole section on structure beginning with XXX, V, I, that's that 38 in your introduction, it explains prosody to you, and it explains rhythm, and it explains rests and stresses, that da-dum, da-dum, da-dum beat, right? So at the bottom of that page, under prosody, there is, in italics there, a line, that time of year thou mayest in me behold. You'll notice the little accent marks above the words, that time, right? The little U-shaped symbol, that means rest. And the accent above time, that little lift up to the right, that's an accent, so that means a stress. So rest, stress, rest, stress, rest, stress is a pattern. And poetry does this. English poetry in particular attends to this pacing. And so it gives you a sort of a very even way to read. I'm on the next page. That time of year thou mayst in me behold, when yellow leaves, or none or few, do hang upon those boughs which shake against the cold. Okay, I'm exaggerating and it sounds kind of weird, but I'm trying to exaggerate for you to illustrate that there's a regular pace to the poem, and that poetry, most poetry, and certainly poetry written in English, has that regular pattern that sort of tells you when to rest, when to stress, when to pause, when to breathe, when to rush forward. And so these elements of enjambment and caesuras, and again you can mark them with punctuation. Enjambment is a line run over. That means that there's no punctuation at the end of the line. The line ends in the middle of a sentence, in other words. Okay? So that's a running over, and the caesura, if you like, is kind of the opposite. It's a cutting in the middle. It's a pause that happens in the middle of a line. All right, so this is what I would like you to attend to before you complete your timed essay. Just take this little lesson and apply it to the poem that you are working with and see what you can find insofar as irregular beats, irregular pausing, irregular running over, instances of enjambment and caesuras, and practice reading those aloud and see what you come up with. See if you feel like these differences, these irregularities in the line, are heightening the experience of the poem in some way. Good luck.